going on, guys? Mr. Drosty here, and we're going to talk about some of the causes of the American Revolution today. Now, it'd be virtually impossible in one video to go through all of the causes of the American Revolution. So, what I'm going to try to do today is just kind of talk about some of the early causes of the American Revolution. What we're looking at here is the 1760s and the period immediately after the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So, as we look at the early causes of the American Revolution, know that I will be making a later video where we will be looking at some of the causes from the 1770s, which is where the revolution really gets going. That's where the fighting actually breaks out and the war begins. But today, let's look at some of the early primary causes following the French and Indian War that sets the 13 colonies on the path towards the eventual American Revolution the following decade. Let's get to it. So as you take a look at this graphic here on the screen, this shows British national debt over the course of the French and Indian War. And as you can see, the national debt, not quite, but almost doubles from this war. Now, the war was not very popular over in England. They felt like this was a war that they shouldn't have had to fight, but they had to defend their colonies from the French due to the actions of a young George Washington. And William Pitt, who was one of the primary political leaders over in England during the war, basically had three strategies to win the war. Number one, outspend the French, as you can see here. Number two, make it a naval war. Flood the colonies with as many soldiers as they needed to win the war. The Redcoats coming over here to fight with the colonial militias. Now, the first one I talked about here, obviously outspending the French, the idea was they would pay it back later. And that's what they're going to do. And that is going to set the colonies on the course towards the American Revolution and us having a United States of America. So as we move through this, we can see that there's several problems, all right, following the French and Indian War. Number one, they made something called the Proclamation of 1763. If you look at this map up here, this red line, essentially what they were saying was the colonists could not move west of that line, that this territory was reserved for the American Indians. And this angered the colonists because they kind of felt like people had given their lives. This was going to be a very expensive war to pay back. They defeated the French. Why can't they use the land that they fought a multi-year war for? But the British didn't want to bring about any more conflict with the natives on the frontier, and so they made the proclamation line so that the colonists wouldn't move out there. So they felt like they just couldn't use the land that they had fought so hard for. There was also this issue after the French and Indian War of how many permanent British troops were stationed here. So after the war was over, they didn't recall all of them back to England. In fact, many thousands of them stayed here in the colonies. And that brought, in the long run, in the long term, it brought about conflict with the colonists because these soldiers were not paid very well. And since they weren't paid very well, they actually had to take up second jobs in a lot of circumstances, and they were competing with the colonists for jobs. Now, if you're a colonist here in the 13 colonies and you're trying to find work, and now you have to compete with outsiders, the redcoats, for work, you're going to be very resentful about that because you feel like they shouldn't even be here now, right? The war is over. What are they doing here? But the British really wanted to keep order over the colonies. They wanted to prevent another war from breaking out, so they left them here, and that was a source of conflict. And then lastly, of course, as I've been talking about, going back to the beginning of this video, the fact that Britain was in massive debt from the war, and they have to pay it back somehow. Now, it wasn't just the American colonists who were being taxed. They were taxing the British citizens as well, but they did feel like, look, the colonists should have to help pay for this because they started the war, and a lot of the war was fought over here. And honestly, on the surface, that wasn't an irrational thought. Yes, we did start the war through George Washington's actions in the Ohio River Valley, and we probably should have to start having to pay for it. But it was the manner in which these taxes were passed. You've all probably heard the saying, no taxation without representation, that brings about all the controversy and leads to the Americans eventually declaring independence by the mid-1770s. But let's talk about some of these taxes that took effect or maybe were renewed that caused the American colonists to become angered. So the British were looking at ending the smuggling problem. There had been a smuggling problem in the colonies for decades and decades and decades. And the smuggling problem was that people were bringing in products and not paying taxes on them when they were brought into the colonies. There was a molasses tax passed in the 1730s. And when the colonists brought in molasses from the Caribbean, they were supposed to pay a tax on that. This was supposed to raise revenue, but also encourage the colonists to buy molasses from the British Empire. But in fact, people were avoiding those taxes and they were bringing in molasses illegally by not paying those taxes. So in 1764, the British Parliament decided to renew that molasses tax from 1733 to bring it up to date, so to speak. And so they passed the new Sugar Act of 1764. And what the Sugar Act did, this is sometimes confusing for students, is it actually was a tax cut. Prior, the previous molasses tax had been 6 pence per gallon of molasses or sugar brought into the colonies. The new Sugar Act would be 3 pence per gallon. So they cut the tax in half. So why were the people so angry about it? Well, they were so angry about it because of the fact that now it was really going to be enforced. Prior, the old molasses tax, it just wasn't being enforced. It was easy to avoid. They just didn't really have the infrastructure in place for the British Empire to make the colonists, the merchants, pay the tax. But now they're going to bring in the military, right? They're going to make sure you pay that tax. So if previously, when it was 6 pence per gallon, it was easy to avoid, you really weren't out the money. If it's 3 pence per gallon now, but it is really enforced and you can't avoid it, you're actually out more money, right? Because now you're actually paying it, where before you were avoiding it. So the colonists didn't like it. I will say, though, the colonists acknowledged that the British did have the right to issue this tax. All right. This is what's called an indirect tax. It was on foreign exports coming into the colonies. They didn't like it, but they acknowledged, look, the British Empire has had these indirect taxes for a long, long time, and they can do it. We don't like it. We're going to grumble about it, but they can do it. And that was vastly different from the next one we're going to talk about. So the Stamp Act of 1765 was the most controversial act and tax passed by the British Parliament during this period. So, like I said, the Sugar Act was on trade. It was an external tax. It was an indirect tax. All right. The colonists didn't like it, but the British could do it, right? Now, the colonists could avoid paying it because they could simply refuse to engage in, trading for foreign molasses from the Caribbean. Now, the Stamp Act was different. This was on internal affairs. It was a direct tax on the citizens. This was the first time the American colonists had been internally taxed. The Stamp Act forced the colonists to pay for a literal stamp on paper goods. It was on marriage licenses. It was on contracts. It was even on things like posters and playing cards. Now, if you want to get married, you're going to have to pay the stamp tax to get that official document. If you wanted an official document on paper, you had to have the stamp for it, and you had to be purchasing that stamp, which was an internal tax. So this is different from, say, the Sugar Act, because here you couldn't avoid it. Like I said, if you wanted a contract, if you wanted to get married, you had to pay the tax. You couldn't get around it. It was on the internal affairs of the colonists. They were directly taxing the colonists now. It wasn't on trade like the Sugar Act, and that's what made this so controversial. Now, the British had used stamp taxes over in Britain before, but they had never done it here in the colonies, and that's why it was so controversial. It was also controversial because the colonists felt like internal taxing like this should only be decided by their own representatives here in their local elected governments. Now, the parliament across the Atlantic Ocean over in England that was passing this tax, the Americans, the colonists, they had no representation over there, right? They were not electing leaders to the British Parliament. So this is where that whole rallying cry about no taxation without representation comes from, because they simply didn't have representation. This would be like, here in America, where I'm making this video, if your state didn't elect people to the House of Representatives or the US Senate, yet those two governing bodies passed taxes that impacted your state. You would think that that's not fair because there's no local representation that is involved with debating those policies. And that's how the American colonists felt. And so that's why that rallying cry comes to be, and it's going to be the cry that carries through until the revolution begins in the next decade, in the 1770s. Another thing, in 1767, writs of assistance was passed. This was not a new concept. It was again passed and updated in 1767. Writs of assistance, essentially what it was a general search warrant. So the stamp collectors and the officials working for the British government had the right to go to private businesses and look for evidence of smuggling. Like I said, a general search warrant. They could use this for anyone they saw fit to make sure that those merchants were not bringing in products illegally and avoiding taxes. They really wanted to handle the smuggling problem and make sure the Americans were paying their taxes. So one of the most famous groups that organizes to protest these taxes, like the stamp tax and the sugar tax, was the Sons of Liberty. Here on the screen, you can see some of the most famous members of the Sons of Liberty: Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, Patrick Henry, Benedict Arnold, and John Hancock. John Hancock was one of the most notorious merchants and smugglers here in the colonies. He made a lot of money off of smuggling and avoiding taxes. So he had a monetary interest in avoiding these taxes. And what you're going to see is the majority of the people that argue for the American Revolution, at least initially, are involved in commerce. They're merchants because they have the most to gain from kind of getting out of the umbrella of the British Empire and being able to do, whatever they want. Free enterprise, free commerce, making as much money as possible. So it is the merchants, it's the people that have a little bit more money that are advocating for a revolution, and they've got to get the everyday people on their side eventually, because those everyday citizens, they may not realize why they should want an American Revolution. And so the Sons of Liberty are going to be out to convince them why they do. But the Sons of Liberty were not the only group that was arguing for a revolution. Another group that was very instrumental in these boycotts that are going to come up here to get things like the Stamp Act repealed, to try to get the British government to repeal the Sugar Act, is the Daughters of Liberty. All right, so the Daughters of Liberty, someone like Abigail Adams, the wife of future President John Adams, was involved in this group. Look at it this way: the women were oftentimes involved in what was being purchased for the household, right? So if there's going to be a boycott of British goods, oftentimes it was the women of the households that could enforce that. And the Daughters of Liberty was a group that was created to enforce boycotts of British goods. They also held things like spinning bees in public, where they were making textiles, that is clothing, for the colonies, so that the colonies could successfully boycott buying British textiles. These boycotts were being used as a way to apply economic pressure to the British to get things like the Stamp Act, specifically the Stamp Act, repealed. So the way that the colonists got the Stamp Act repealed was by holding something called the Stamp Act Congress, where several colonies got together and agreed to stop buying British products. The whole idea here is, look, we can get the British companies, businesses, to protest that their government repeal the stamp tax on the American colonies. Now, these businesses had basically relied upon the colonies to buy their products. It was a sweet deal for them because they had a guaranteed market over here in the 13 colonies. They knew if they were sending products over there, they were going to sell, because the colonists didn't have much say in where they were getting products from. And you had all these British products, flooding the market, guaranteed sales. But if all of a sudden the American colonists decide, you know what, we're not going to buy those products anymore, then all that revenue that these British companies had been counting on is out the door, and they're hurting. And so that was the idea behind the British boycott that the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty and the Stamp Act Congress pushed for. That was the whole idea, is to apply economic pressure to those businesses so that they hurt and they protest their government to repeal the Stamp Act, so those Americans start buying from them again. And that is exactly what happened. Those merchants did beg for the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, and it was repealed in 1766. So the Stamp Act was not the law of the land for very long, but it was instrumental in bringing about a lot of anger from the colonists and eventually, kind of starting that snowball rolling towards the eventual American Revolution through all of these protests against the British government over these taxes that are being levied upon the colonists, especially the ones like the Stamp Act that were on internal affairs, and the Americans just didn't have representation, and they had a big problem with that. So those are some of the early causes of the American Revolution. We'll be talking about more of them here in the future because, like I said at the top of the video, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the causes of the American Revolution. But we'll save that for another video. Hope you enjoyed this one. If you want more great American history videos, lessons, review to help you succeed in school, or if you just have an interest in American history, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You're going to see it right down here below the video or right above me right now. Click subscribe. I've got new videos coming each and every week. I'm Mr. Drosty. We'll see you guys next time.